She wasn't running because she was weak. She was running because she knew too much. The city had not yet woken, but it was never truly asleep. Even in the quiet hours before sunrise, movement existed in subtle forms. Vehicles passing without headlights, figures crossing empty streets with purpose, decisions being made in places no one officially recognized. The world Harper Voss was leaving behind did not rely on daylight to function. It operated continuously, quietly, and without mercy. That was why she chose this time. Not because it was safer, but because it was predictable. Harper moved through the outer edge of the airport terminal with controlled precision, her pace steady, her posture composed. Nothing about her suggested urgency. Nothing about her hinted at fear. To anyone watching, she appeared like any other early traveler. Someone with a destination, a schedule, a reason to be there. But appearances, she had learned, were often the most dangerous form of deception. Her reflection passed briefly across the glass entrance as she stepped inside. For a moment, she caught a glimpse of herself. Neutral expression, simple clothing, nothing memorable. It was intentional. Everything about her presence had been calculated down to the smallest detail. Because in a world where people were hunted, being forgettable was survival. That was the intellectual hook. Because the safest way to disappear is not to run faster than those chasing you. It's to become someone they would never think to look for. The terminal lights cast a soft glow across the polished floors, illuminating rows of empty seating and distant counters slowly coming to life. Staff move in routine patterns, their focus limited to tasks, not people. Security checkpoints remained open but not crowded. The environment functioned on structure, not suspicion. And for now, that worked in her favor. Harper adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, her movement subtle, unnoticeable. The bag itself was unremarkable, small enough to avoid attention, large enough to carry what she needed. She did not check it repeatedly. She did not hold it tightly, because attachment created visibility. Instead, she carried it like it meant nothing, but it didn't. Her path through the terminal followed a precise route, not the shortest, not the fastest, but the least observable. She avoided direct lines of sight, choosing angles that kept her movement within peripheral spaces rather than central focus. Cameras were placed strategically, but systems like these always relied on patterns. And Harper had spent enough time studying patterns to know how to break them. Her gaze never lifted directly toward the surveillance points, but her awareness tracked them all the same. The slight tilt of the lens, the blind intervals between rotations, the reflective surfaces that revealed more than they should. She didn't need to see them directly. She just needed to know where not to be. That was the emotional hook, because the people who survive long enough to escape are the ones who learn how to move without being seen. A few travelers had begun to gather near the central waiting area, their presence creating a natural layer of distraction. Harper blended into that space without hesitation, her movement slowing just enough to match the environment around her. Normal behavior, expected behavior, invisible behavior. She paused briefly near an information display, her gaze scanning the departure schedules without appearing focused. Flights listed, times confirmed, gates assigned, everything operating exactly as it should, exactly as expected. And that was the only reason it felt temporary. Because Harper understood something most people didn't. Safety built on routine was not real safety. It was delay. Her flight was already confirmed. The ticket secured under a name that did not raise flags. The destination chosen not for distance, but for purpose. Every step leading to this moment had been planned carefully, deliberately, without error, because error was not something she could afford. Not anymore. She moved again, this time toward the security checkpoint, her pace steady, her expression unchanged. The line was short, the process routine. Bag scanned, documents verified, faces barely examined. Efficiency replaced suspicion, and for a brief moment, everything aligned. Her identification passed without question. Her bag moved through inspection without delay. No alarms, no hesitation, no second glance. To anyone watching, she was just another passenger. But Harper didn't relax, because she understood something deeper than most. Just because a system allows you through doesn't mean you're not being followed inside it. That was the intellectual hook. Because the most dangerous place to feel safe is the place designed to control movement. On the other side of security, the terminal opened into a wider space, filled with early travelers, quiet conversations, and the steady rhythm of announcements preparing for the day ahead. Harper adjusted her direction slightly, moving toward her assigned gate without drawing attention to it. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She simply moved, because movement was the only thing keeping her ahead. But even as she approached the gate area, something beneath the surface began to shift, not externally, internally, a quiet awareness, a subtle misalignment, the kind that did not announce itself loudly, but existed just enough to be felt. Harper slowed slightly, her gaze shifting briefly, not enough to appear suspicious, but enough to confirm something she could not yet define. Nothing looked wrong. Everything remained in place. But that didn't matter, because she had learned something long ago. The absence of visible danger did not mean the absence of danger. That was the emotional hook, because the moment something feels wrong, without a clear reason, is often the moment it already is. She continued forward, her posture unchanged, her expression controlled, but her awareness sharpened. Every movement around her became more precise, every sound more distinct, every presence more defined, because now she was not just moving, she was calculating. A man passed by her left side, his pace normal, his attention elsewhere. A woman adjusted her bag near the seating area, her focus entirely on her phone. A staff member moved toward the counter, preparing for boarding procedures. All normal, all expected, and yet something remained off. Harper reached the edge of the gate area, positioning herself just within view of the boarding line, but not directly inside it. A calculated distance, close enough to move quickly, far enough to observe. She placed her bag down beside her, her posture relaxed, her gaze neutral, waiting, not idly, intentionally, because waiting was part of the plan. Time passed quietly, marked only by the soft shift of movement around her and the distant echo of announcements filling the terminal. And still, nothing happened. No interruption, no confrontation, no sign that anything had gone wrong, which was exactly what made it dangerous. Because Harper knew something most people didn't. When something is supposed to go wrong, and it doesn't, it usually means it already has. That was the intellectual hook. Because the real threat is not the one you see coming. It's the one that arrives before you realize it has. Her gaze shifted once more, this time slightly longer, slightly more focused. Still nothing obvious. Still nothing clear. But the feeling remained, and feelings like that were never accidental. Harper exhaled slowly, her control intact, her movement still measured, because reacting now would expose too much, and exposure was not an option. Not here, not now. She adjusted her position slightly, preparing for the next phase. Boarding would begin soon. The final step, the moment where movement turned into escape. If everything continued as planned, she would be gone before sunrise fully touched the city. Gone before anyone could stop her. Gone before the past could catch up. But plans were only reliable until someone else understood them. And as Harper stood there, calm on the surface, controlled in every movement, aligned with every step she had carefully designed, one reality had already shifted beyond her awareness. Because somewhere else, someone had already seen what she thought was hidden. Someone had already followed the pattern she believed she had broken. Someone had already found the one detail she thought would protect her, her ticket. And as the quiet rhythm of the airport continued around her, untouched by the invisible tension building beneath it, one undeniable truth settled into place. But before her flight could even be announced, someone else already had her ticket details. She thought a ticket could give her freedom, but it became proof of where she was really going. The system did not fail. It responded. Long before Harper Voss stepped into the airport, before she adjusted her pace to match the early travelers, before she positioned herself carefully within spaces designed to make people feel anonymous, her movement had already created a ripple, not visible, not immediate, but precise. because systems built on control did not wait for mistakes. They identified patterns. And Harper, despite everything she had done to remain invisible, had followed one pattern she could not erase: a destination. That was the intellectual hook. Because no matter how carefully someone hides their identity, their destination always reveals their intention. Miles away from the quiet structure of the airport, inside a space where silence carried authority rather than absence, Dante Cross stood in front of a system that did not miss details. His world did not operate on noise or reaction. It operated on access. Access to information, access to movement, access to decisions made by people who believed they were acting alone. The room around him remained still, controlled, and deliberate. No unnecessary movement. No wasted energy. Everything existed with purpose, including him. Dante did not search for Harper Voss. He did not need to, because people like him did not chase individuals. They tracked outcomes. And Harper's outcome had already begun the moment she secured her flight. A screen illuminated in front of him, displaying fragmented data pulled from multiple systems. Flight logs, booking records, identity confirmations. Individually, each piece meant nothing. Together, they formed a path. Dante's gaze moved across the information without urgency. His expression remained composed, his posture unchanged. To anyone observing, it would appear as if he was simply reviewing routine data. But there was nothing routine about this, because one name did not align: Harper Voss. It was not the name itself that stood out. It was the absence of everything behind it. Minimal history, limited traceability, clean movement. Too clean. That was the problem, because in a world where everyone left traces, clean records meant controlled records, and controlled records meant intent. That was the emotional hook, because when someone erases their past perfectly, it means they are not running blindly. They are moving with purpose. Dante shifted slightly, his attention narrowing as he accessed deeper layers of the system. Not public data, not surface-level information. Something else. Something only a few could reach. Airport internal systems were not designed to be accessed externally, but systems were built by people, and people could be influenced. A quiet confirmation appeared on the screen. A transaction verified. A booking confirmed. A route locked in. Flight number. Departure time. Destination. Everything Harper believed was hidden was now visible. Dante did not react immediately, because reaction suggested surprise. And nothing about this surprised him. What interested him was why. He leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the final detail that mattered: the destination. Because that was where intent became clear. That was the intellectual hook. Because people don't choose where they're going randomly. They choose where their story continues. The location was not distant enough to be escape, not isolated enough to disappear, not common enough to be coincidence. It was specific, deliberate, and connected. Dante's expression shifted not visibly, but internally, because now the pattern aligned. This was not a random exit, not a desperate move, not a last attempt to survive. This was structured, planned, executed with precision, which meant Harper Voss was not running. She was moving toward something, and that changed everything. The room remained silent, but the atmosphere shifted slightly as Dante stepped away from the screen. He did not issue commands immediately. He did not alert anyone, because action, without understanding, created mistakes. And Dante Cross did not make mistakes. Instead, he observed, reconstructed, analyzed, because now he needed to see the full picture. Harper's entry into the system, her controlled identity, her precise timing, her chosen destination. Every element pointed to one conclusion. This was not fear-driven behavior. This was intentional movement. And intentional movement always had a reason. That was the emotional hook, because the difference between running away and moving forward is knowing exactly where you're going. Dante turned slightly, his presence shifting the stillness of the room without effort. "Keep the system open," he said quietly. The instruction was simple, but its implication was not, because keeping the system open meant one thing. He was not stopping her yet. He was watching. That decision was not hesitation. It was control, because acting too soon would disrupt the pattern, and patterns revealed truth. Across the city, the airport continued its quiet progression toward morning. Passengers gathered, flights prepared, announcements echoed softly through the space, and Harper Voss remained exactly where she believed she was safest, inside the system, unnoticed, untracked, unseen. But that belief was already broken, because someone else was now part of her movement, someone who understood systems better than she did, someone who did not need to follow her directly. To reach her, Dante moved toward the exit, his steps measured, his presence contained. He did not rush, because time was already on his side. The distance between him and the airport did not matter, because the outcome was already defined. He entered his vehicle without hesitation, the engine starting with controlled precision. No urgency, no aggression, just movement, because this was not a chase. It was alignment. The road ahead remained clear, the early hours keeping traffic minimal, the city still transitioning between silence and motion. Dante's focus remained steady, not on the path in front of him, but on the path Harper had already chosen, because he understood something she did not. Every system had layers, and while she had navigated the visible ones, she had stepped directly into the deeper structure, the one that did not rely on cameras, or guards, or checkpoints, the one that relied on information. And information was where he dominated. That was the intellectual hook, because no matter how far someone runs, they can't escape the system that already knows where they're going. Back at the airport, Harper adjusted her position slightly, her awareness still sharp, her control still intact. Nothing had changed. Nothing had shifted. Everything remained exactly as it should, which was why she didn't realize anything had already gone wrong. Her ticket remained secure, her identity unchallenged, her path uninterrupted. Every step still aligned with the plan she had built so carefully. But plans only worked when they remained unknown, and hers no longer was. Dante's vehicle moved to the final stretch of road, leading toward the airport, his presence approaching without announcement, without disruption, without resistance, because he did not need force to control the situation. He only needed to arrive, and arrival was inevitable. The terminal came into view, its structure illuminated by the first hints of morning light, its interior already alive with movement. To everyone else, it was just another day, another series of departures, another routine flow of travelers moving from one place to another. But for Dante, it was something else. It was a controlled environment, a system he had already entered. Before physically stepping inside it, he stepped out of the vehicle, his posture composed, his gaze steady as it moved toward the entrance. No urgency, no distraction, just certainty, because he already knew exactly where she was. Not her position in the building, not her location in the crowd, but something more important, her intention. And intention always led to outcome. That was the emotional hook, because finding someone is easy when you already know where they're going. Inside the terminal, Harper remained unaware, still waiting, still aligned, still believing that she had done everything necessary to disappear. But the truth was already unfolding beyond her control. Dante entered the airport without interruption, his movement blending into the environment with the same precision Harper had used. But where her invisibility was defensive, his was absolute, because he was not hiding. He was integrating. His gaze moved across the space once, not searching, not scanning, recognizing, because everything he needed to know, he already had. The ticket, the time, the destination, the outcome. And as that final detail settled into place, confirming what had already begun to take shape in his mind, one realization became clear. This was not an escape, not even close. This was something far more deliberate, far more structured, far more dangerous. And as Dante cross-stepped fully into the system Harper believed she controlled, his understanding completed itself with quiet precision, because the moment he read her destination, he realized this was an escape. It was a mission. The scariest thing was not that he found her. It was that he already knew why she ran. The system did not break when he entered it. It adjusted. The airport continued to function exactly as it was designed to. Orderly, predictable, efficient. Announcements echoed at controlled intervals. Passengers moved in organized lines. Screens updated without delay. Everything operated with the illusion of neutrality. But systems like this were never neutral. They only appeared that way to those who did not understand them. Harper Voss stood near her assigned gate, her posture composed, her movements minimal. Nothing about her behavior suggested urgency. Nothing indicated fear. But internally, everything had shifted, not because she had seen him yet, but because something inside her had already recognized a change. That was the intellectual hook. Because the human instinct for danger doesn't begin when you see the threat. It begins when something no longer feels controlled. Her gaze moved subtly across the terminal, not searching, but confirming. Patterns, positions, movement flow. Everything remained consistent, too consistent. And that was the problem, because unpredictability often disguised itself as normality. She adjusted her stance slightly, her attention narrowing without drawing focus to itself. And then she saw him. Dante Cross did not stand out in the way most powerful men did. He did not demand attention. He did not create disruption. He existed within the environment, as if he had always been part of it. That was what made him dangerous, because visibility invited reaction, but presence controlled it. Harper's eyes met his for less than a second. That was all it took, because recognition did not require time. That was the emotional hook, because fear is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet certainty that escape is no longer possible. Her body did not react. No sudden movement, no visible tension, no step backward, because reacting would confirm something she was not ready to reveal. But internally, the structure she had built began to shift, not collapse, not yet, but adjust, because now the situation had changed. Dante did not move toward her immediately. He did not need to, because distance was no longer relevant. He had already reached her, not physically, mentally, strategically, completely. He stopped a few meters away, positioned in a way that did not block her directly, but controlled every path available to her. Exit routes, alternate directions, visual barriers. Everything had been accounted for, without effort, without force. That was the intellectual hook. Because the most effective control is not forcing someone to stay. It's removing every reason they believe they can leave. Harper understood it instantly, not because she analyzed it, because she recognized it. This was not improvisation. This was design. Her gaze shifted slightly, mapping her options in real time. Left, too exposed. Right, interrupted flow. Back, restricted by timing. Forward, him. And for the first time since entering the airport, her plan no longer aligned. But she did not move, because movement now would be a mistake. Dante observed her without interruption, his attention precise, his expression unchanged. He was not studying her actions. He was studying her restraint, because most people in her position would react. They would panic, adjust, break. But Harper Voss did none of those things. And that confirmed everything he needed to know. That was the emotional hook. Because the absence of fear doesn't mean safety. It often means experience. He took a single step closer, measured, controlled, enough to reduce distance, but not enough to trigger reaction. Harper held her position. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged, but her awareness fully engaged, because now this was no longer escape. This was confrontation. The space between them carried no visible tension. To anyone watching, nothing unusual was happening. Two individuals standing near a boarding gate. No raised voices. No sudden movement. No disruption. But beneath that surface, everything had changed. Dante's gaze held hers, not aggressively, not challengingly, but knowingly. And that was what made it worse. Because there was no question in his eyes, no uncertainty, no need to confirm. He already understood. That was the intellectual hook. Because being found is one thing, Being understood is something else entirely. Harper shifted her weight slightly, not retreating, not advancing, repositioning, maintaining control over what remained. Because control, even in limited space, mattered, Dante noticed. Of course he did, because nothing she did was accidental. "You planned this well," he said quietly. His voice did not rise above the surrounding noise, but it didn't need to, because the words were not meant for anyone else. Harper did not respond, not verbally, because responding would open a structure she was still controlling, but her silence was not denial, and Dante understood that. He stepped slightly to the side, adjusting his position just enough to close a final open path she had not yet considered. Not blocking, not forcing, just removing possibility. That was the emotional hook, because true control doesn't trap you physically. It makes you realize you were never free to begin with. Harper's options were now complete, not reduced, not limited, defined. Every path she could take, and in the same way, with him, and that realization settled quietly, not as panic, but as clarity, because she understood something now. Running was no longer strategy. It was a reaction, and reactions were predictable. She turned slightly, her gaze moving away for a brief moment, not to escape, but to think, because thinking was the only move she had left. Dante watched her carefully, his attention unwavering, not because he was waiting for her to act, but because he already knew she wouldn't. Not yet, because Harper Voss was not impulsive. She was deliberate, which meant she would choose her next move carefully. And that gave him time. Time he did not need, but used anyway. That was the intellectual hook. Because when someone stops running, it means they realize movement won't change the outcome. The announcement for her flight echoed softly through the terminal. Boarding would begin soon. Time was narrowing, but neither of them moved, because this moment was no longer about time. It was about control. Dante's gaze shifted briefly to her bag. Not casually, not randomly, intentionally. Harper noticed. Of course she did. And that was the first real shift in her composure. Not visible, not obvious, but present, because the bag was not just luggage. It was purpose. And if he had noticed it, then something had already gone further than she expected. Dante's attention returned to her, and for the first time, he moved his hand, slowly, deliberately, not toward her, toward the space between them. And then he revealed it, a small object, simple, ordinary, but unmistakable, taken from her bag without her realizing. And in that moment, everything changed, because it was not something she could replace, not something she could deny, not something she could explain away. It was proof of intention, of direction, of purpose. That was the emotional hook, because the most dangerous moment is not when someone catches you. It's when they uncover what you were trying to protect. Harper's eyes locked onto it, her control holding, but barely, because this she had not planned for. Not this level of access, not this level of precision. Dante held it calmly, his expression unchanged, his understanding now complete, because whatever she had been trying to do, whatever this mission truly was, this object connected everything. And as the silence between them deepened, carrying the weight of what had just been exposed, one undeniable truth settled into place. Then Dante revealed something from her bag, something she never expected him to find. She was not carrying clothes for a new life. She was carrying the truth that could end one. The object in Dante Cross's hand did not look dangerous. It wasn't large. It wasn't complex. It didn't carry the kind of presence that demanded attention. But power had never depended on appearance. It depended on what something contained. And this contained everything. Harper Voss did not move forward to take it back. She did not step away either, because both actions would confirm the same thing, that it mattered, and it did. That was the intellectual hook, because the most dangerous weapon is not the one that destroys instantly. It is the one that reveals everything at once. Dante held the small drive between his fingers with deliberate stillness, his gaze shifting briefly from the object back to her, not questioning, not demanding, understanding, because whatever this was, it had been protected, hidden carefully enough to pass unnoticed, but not carefully enough to escape him. And that was the first mistake. The space between them tightened, not physically, but in meaning, because now this was no longer about escape. It was about exposure. Harper's control remained intact on the surface. Her posture stayed composed, her expression neutral, her breathing steady. But internally, something had shifted. Not fear, not panic, calculation. Because the moment something hidden is revealed, the entire strategy must change. Dante's voice remained low, almost absorbed by the ambient noise of the terminal. This wasn't for survival. It wasn't a question. It was a conclusion. Harper didn't answer, because answering would simplify something that was not simple. The drive in his hand represented more than information. It represented intention, and intention was something she had guarded carefully. That was the emotional hook, because when your plan is exposed, you don't lose control, you lose the advantage. Dante turned the drive slightly, examining it as if its physical form might reveal more than its content. But he already knew objects like this were never random. They were chosen, prepared, protected, which meant whatever was inside it was deliberate. "Where were you taking it?" he asked. The question was direct, but the tone was not, because he wasn't asking for location. He was asking for purpose. Harper's gaze remained fixed on him, her silence steady, her awareness sharp, because now every word mattered. Not just what was said, but what was not. That was the intellectual hook, because silence in the right moment is not avoidance. It is control. Dante studied her carefully, reading not her words, but her restraint. She wasn't denying. She wasn't deflecting. She was choosing not to reveal. And that confirmed everything. He slipped the drive into his palm, closing his fingers around it. Not to hide it, but to secure it, because now this was no longer hers. At least not entirely. And that changed the structure of the moment. Harper adjusted her stance slightly, her focus narrowing, not on the drive anymore, but on him, because the object was no longer the only factor. He was, and his understanding was evolving. That was the emotional hook, because the real danger is not losing what you carry. It's the person who understands why you were carrying it. Dante's gaze sharpened. "You're not running," he said quietly. "You're delivering." The words landed with precision, because they reframed everything. This was not escape, not fear, not survival. This was movement toward a destination, a controlled action, a planned transfer. Harper didn't deny it, because denial would be pointless now. Instead, she remained still, her silence confirming more than words ever could. Dante exhaled slowly, his thoughts aligning. This was bigger than he had initially calculated. Much bigger, because if someone like her, with her control, her discipline, her awareness, was carrying something like this, then the implications extended far beyond a single situation. This was not personal. This was structural. That was the intellectual hook. Because information doesn't just expose individuals. It destabilizes entire systems. His attention shifted briefly to the surrounding environment. Still normal, still controlled, still unaware. But that normality was fragile, because whatever was on that drive had the potential to disrupt far more than this moment. He turned his focus back to her. "This affects more than just you." Again, not a question, a realization. Harper's gaze didn't waver, because that was the truth. And she had never been trying to protect herself. That was the part no one had understood. Until now, that was the emotional hook, because she wasn't trying to save her life. She was trying to change something bigger than it. Dante took a slow step closer, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with intent, because now distance no longer mattered. Understanding did. "You're not a victim," he said. The statement settled between them with quiet finality, because it removed the last false assumption. Harper Voss was not someone caught in a situation. She was someone who had stepped into it, knowingly, deliberately, and that changed everything. She met his gaze without hesitation, because there was no point in pretending otherwise anymore. Her role was no longer hidden, but it was not fully revealed either. And that balance was critical. Dante studied her closely, his perception shifting with every second, because now he was no longer looking at someone escaping. He was looking at someone carrying leverage, power, and risk all at once. That was the intellectual hook, because the moment someone holds information like this, they become both an asset and a threat. The question was, which one she intended to be. His voice lowered slightly. Who is it for? The question was sharper now, more focused, because this was the center of everything. Not the drive, not the airport, not the escape, the destination. Harper held his gaze for a long moment before responding, and when she did, her voice remained calm, controlled, but precise. Not who you think. The answer was minimal, but it shifted the direction completely, because it removed the obvious. Law enforcement, authorities, systems built to contain information like this. If it wasn't for them, then it was for something else. Something less predictable. Something more dangerous. That was the emotional hook. Because the truth isn't always meant to be exposed. Sometimes it's meant to be delivered to the right person. Dante's mind moved quickly, recalculating every possibility. If she wasn't going to the authorities, then this was not about justice. At least not in the conventional sense. This was about leverage, exchange, power, but not hers, someone else's. And that realization shifted everything again, because now this wasn't just about what she carried. It was about who she trusted to receive it. And people like that were never ordinary. He stepped slightly to the side, adjusting his position once more, not to block her, but to redefine the space. Because now the situation required a different approach. You're playing a dangerous game, he said, not as a warning. As a fact, Harper's expression didn't change. Only if you don't understand it. The response came smoothly, without hesitation, without fear. And that was the problem, because she wasn't uncertain. She knew exactly what she was doing. And people like that were the hardest to control. That was the intellectual hook. Because confidence without protection is reckless. But confidence with a plan is power. Dante's gaze narrowed slightly, his attention sharpening. Because now, he wasn't just evaluating her actions. He was evaluating her position. And her position was stronger than he had expected. Not physically, not structurally, but strategically. Because she had something that could shift balance. Across multiple layers. Across multiple people. Across multiple outcomes. And that made her dangerous, but also valuable. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it carried weight. Not uncertainty, not hesitation, but calculation. From both sides. Because now, this was no longer about control. It was about decision. What happens next would not be accidental. It would be chosen. Carefully. Deliberately. Irreversibly. That was the emotional hook. Because the moment both sides understand the stakes, every move becomes final. Dante looked at her one last time, his thoughts fully aligned now. She was not running. She was not hiding. She was moving toward something. And whatever that something was, it was powerful enough to risk everything for. His grip on the drive tightened slightly, not out of tension, but out of clarity. Because now, he understood the real situation. And as that understanding settled completely, connecting every piece into a single, undeniable structure, one final realization emerged. But the truth she carried was not meant for the law. It was meant for someone far more dangerous. The city on her ticket was not a place to hide. It was the place where the truth was waiting. The drive was no longer the center of the situation. The destination was. Dante Cross did not need to open a file to understand that. Information alone was powerful, but information tied to a location, that created intent. And intent revealed purpose. He stood across from Harper Voss, The quiet tension between them no longer about control, but about alignment. Every piece of the situation had begun to connect, but one detail remained incomplete: where she was going, because where someone carries truth matters as much as the truth itself. That was the intellectual hook, because information is only dangerous when it reaches the right place. Dante shifted his attention slightly, not toward her, but toward the system that had already provided him with something far more useful than speculation. Her ticket, her route, her destination. A city that, at first glance, held no immediate significance. It wasn't a major hub for power. It wasn't known for conflict. It wasn't strategically important in any obvious way, which meant it mattered, because nothing about Harper's movement had been random, and randomness did not exist in decisions like this. He spoke quietly, his tone measure controlled. That city isn't for hiding. Again, not a question, a realization. Harper did not respond immediately, because the moment had shifted. This was no longer about what she carried. It was about where she was taking it. And that was far more revealing. She held his gaze, her composure unchanged, but her silence intentional. That was the emotional hook. Because when someone refuses to confirm something obvious, it usually means the truth is worse than expected. Dante's mind moved quickly, aligning the destination with fragments of information he had not needed to consider before. Not recent, not active, but historical. Because some places did not hold present value. They held past consequences. And past consequences often returned. He turned slightly, his posture still relaxed, but his focus sharpened. That city had an incident, he said. The word choice was deliberate. Not war, not conflict. Incident. Because incidents were controlled, contained, buried. Harper's expression did not change, but something beneath it tightened just enough. That was all Dante needed, because reaction, no matter how small, confirmed relevance. That was the intellectual hook, because the smallest reaction often reveals the biggest truth. He stepped closer, not aggressively, but with precision. Years ago, he continued, something happened there that never made it into the open. A pause. But people like me remember. The statement settled heavily, because memory, in worlds like his, was currency. Harper's gaze remained steady, but internally, everything had aligned. The past had reached the present, and there was no separating them now. That was the emotional hook, because the past doesn't stay buried. It waits for the moment it becomes useful again. Dante's voice lowered slightly. A witness disappeared. The words were simple, but their weight was not, because witnesses in his world did not simply vanish. They were removed, silenced, erased, which meant if one had disappeared without confirmation, then something had gone wrong, or someone had survived. Harper did not interrupt, did not deny, did not explain, because now the truth was unfolding on its own, and stopping it would only make it clearer. Dante's gaze sharpened further. Officially, they were dead. A pause, but unofficially, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because the implication was already complete. That was the intellectual hook, because in powerful systems, death is not always the end. Sometimes it's just a version of truth people are allowed to see. Harper exhaled slowly, not from fear, but from recognition, because this moment had been inevitable. Not this exact conversation, not this exact place, but this realization. Her past was no longer hidden, not entirely, and Dante was already too close. She shifted her stance slightly, her focus no longer on controlling perception, but managing outcome, because now the situation required something different, not concealment, precision. That was the emotional hook, because when the truth starts revealing itself, control becomes about timing, not hiding. Dante studied her carefully, every detail aligning faster now. The drive, the destination, the silence, the control. It all pointed to one conclusion. This was not about exposing information. It was about delivering it to someone specific, someone connected to that incident, someone connected to that witness. And if that witness was still alive, then everything that had been buried was about to resurface. That was the intellectual hook. Because one surviving truth can destroy an entire constructed lie. His voice remained calm. You're not going there alone. Not a question, a certainty. Harper met his gaze, her expression unchanged. But this time, she didn't deny it. And that confirmed everything. Dante's thoughts aligned completely now. This was no longer speculation. It was structure, the past incident, the missing witness, the hidden information, her involvement, it all connected. But one piece remained undefined, her role, because she was not just a messenger, not just a carrier, not just someone delivering truth. She was connected, directly. That was the emotional hook. Because people don't risk everything for information, unless it belongs to them. Dante stepped slightly to the side, creating space, not distance, but perspective. You're a part of it, he said. The words were direct, precise, unavoidable. Harper did not respond immediately, because the truth, once spoken, could not be reshaped. And this truth changed everything. She had never been just someone caught in the middle. She had never been an outsider. She had always been inside it. That was the intellectual hook. Because the most dangerous players are not the ones who enter the game. They are the ones who were always part of it. Her voice came quieter now, not weaker, more defined. It didn't end. The words were simple, but they carried years of silence, years of absence, years of something unfinished. Dante's gaze did not shift. Of course it didn't. Because nothing like that ever truly ended. It only paused until someone brought it back. And now she had. That was emotional hook. Because unfinished history doesn't disappear. It waits for someone brave enough to face it again. The airport around them continued as if nothing had changed. Passengers moved. Flights were called. Time advanced. But for them, everything had already shifted. Because this was no longer about escape. This was about confrontation, not with each other, with the past. Dante's final realization began to form, pulling every detail into a single, unavoidable conclusion. The witness, the incident, the erased truth, her involvement, her destination. It all aligned into something far more precise. This was not just a delivery. It was a meeting, a planned one, with someone who should not exist. His voice lowered slightly, sharper now. Who are you going to meet? The question carried weight, because the answer would define everything. Harper held his gaze for a long moment, because this was the line, the point where silence would no longer protect anything, the point where truth would reshape everything. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, controlled, but undeniable. Someone who wasn't supposed to survive. The words settled between them with quiet force, because they confirmed everything, and introduced something worse. That was the intellectual hook, because the most dangerous person in any story is the one who was never meant to live long enough to tell it. Dante's expression did not change, but internally, everything shifted, because now, this was bigger than both of them, bigger than the war, bigger than control. This was about truth that had been buried, and was about a return. And as that realization locked into place, connecting past and present into a single, unavoidable reality, one final truth emerged. And the person she was going to meet was someone the world believed was already dead. He thought he had cornered her, until he realized she had prepared for being caught. The truth had already shifted the balance. What stood between Dante Cross and Harper Voss was no longer uncertainty, but clarity, dangerous, precise, and irreversible. The destination had been exposed. The purpose had been understood. The past had returned. But clarity did not guarantee control, because control only belonged to the one who could still make the next move. And that was no longer certain. That was the intellectual hook. Because in a situation where both sides understand the truth, power belongs to the one who planned beyond it. Dante adjusted his stance slightly, his gaze steady, his thoughts aligned with a new structure of possibilities. She was not just carrying leverage. She was positioned within it, which meant force would not work. Not here, not now, because anything forced would break something larger, something neither of them could afford. His voice remained calm, measured, intentional. You don't make it to that destination without protection. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact, because whatever waited for her there was not safe, not for someone carrying what she had, not for someone connected to what she knew. Harper's expression didn't shift, because she already understood that. She had understood it long before entering the airport, long before booking the ticket, long before this moment. That was the emotional hook, because preparation doesn't begin when danger appears. It begins long before it arrives. Dante continued, his tone unchanged. I can get you there. A pause. Safely. The offer was simple, but its implications were not. Protection from him meant access, resources, control over variables she could not manage alone. It was not just safety. It was dominance over the situation. But it came with something else. Cost. And Harper knew that. That was the intellectual hook. Because every offer of protection in a dangerous world is a negotiation for control. She held his gaze, her posture composed, her silence deliberate, because the answer was already decided. No. The word came without hesitation, without adjustment, without uncertainty. And that changed everything. Dante did not react immediately, because reaction would reveal assumption, and assumption was no longer safe. Instead, he studied her more closely, recalibrating his understanding in real time. She wasn't rejecting safety. She was rejecting dependence. That was the emotional hook, because the strongest players don't refuse help out of pride. They refuse it because they don't need it. His voice lowered slightly. You don't have enough leverage to do this alone. Again, not a challenge, a calculation. But Harper didn't respond the way he expected, because she didn't argue. She didn't defend. She didn't explain. She simply remained still. And that stillness carried certainty. That was the intellectual hook. Because silence backed by confidence means one thing. There's something you don't know yet. Dante's perception shifted instantly, because this was no longer about what she had revealed. It was about what she hadn't. His gaze narrowed slightly, his attention sharpening. You planned for this, he said, not questioning, confirming. Harper didn't deny it, because denial would be meaningless now. Her voice came calmly. I planned for every version of this. The statement landed with precision, because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't exaggerated. It was structured, and it was true. That was the emotional hook. Because real strategy doesn't rely on one outcome. It prepares for all of them. Dante exhaled slowly, his thoughts aligning with a new reality. He had assumed control when he found her, assumed leverage when he took the drive, assumed dominance when he understood the destination. But now, those assumptions were shifting, because she had accounted for being found, accounted for being stopped, accounted for him. And that changed the entire structure of power between them. That was the intellectual hook. Because the moment someone plans for your move, you are no longer in control of it. The environment around them remained steady, but beneath that surface, pressure was building. Movement in the terminal had begun to shift, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough. Security patterns adjusting. Unfamiliar faces holding position longer than necessary. Subtle changes that only people like them would notice. Harper noticed. Dante noticed. And both of them understood the same thing. They were no longer the only ones aware of the situation. That was the emotional hook. Because the moment others start closing in, your options don't expand, they disappear. Dante's voice sharpened slightly, though it remained controlled. You don't have time to play this alone. Not a warning, a calculation, because external pressure changed everything. But Harper didn't adjust, didn't rush, didn't panic, because time had already been calculated into her plan. That was the intellectual hook. Because when someone doesn't react to urgency, it means they already accounted for it. Her gaze shifted briefly, not away, but outward, mapping movement, confirming timing. Because now, this was no longer about negotiation. It was about execution. Dante saw it immediately. The shift the decision, and that concerned him, because decisions made without hesitation were the hardest to interrupt. "You're running out of control," he said. Harper looked back at him, her expression unchanged. "No," she replied quietly. "I'm reaching the point where control matters." The distinction was precise, and it was correct. That was the emotional hook, because control is not about avoiding chaos. It's about choosing what happens inside it. Dante stepped closer, closing the distance further, not aggressively, but intentionally, because now he needed to understand the final piece. What happens when you get there? The question was direct, because everything depended on that outcome. Harper held his gaze, and for the first time, there was no deflection, no silence, only clarity. "It ends." The words were simple, but they carried finality, and finality was dangerous. That was the intellectual hook, because people who believe something will end are willing to risk everything to reach that point. Dante absorbed the answer, his mind recalculating once more. If it ended there, then whatever she was delivering, whatever she was connecting, would trigger something irreversible, something that would not just expose truth, but act on it. And that was the real threat, not the information, not the past. The outcome. His attention sharpened. "You're not just delivering it," he said. "You're activating something." Harper didn't respond, but her silence confirmed everything. That was the emotional hook, because the most dangerous plans are not about revealing truth. They are about what that truth triggers next. The tension in the space shifted again, but this time, it wasn't just between them. It was external, closer, more immediate. Dante's awareness expanded instantly, his attention splitting between her and the environment, because now, timing mattered, and something about the timing was off. Harper noticed it too, but unlike him, she didn't react. She didn't adjust. She didn't hesitate, because this was part of it. That was the intellectual hook, because when something feels like a disruption, it might actually be the plan unfolding. Dante's gaze snapped back to her, his realization forming too late to interrupt. "You already started it." Not a question, a realization. Harper met his eyes calmly. "Yes." And in that moment, everything shifted, because whatever she had planned was no longer waiting. It was already in motion. Dante moved instinctively, reaching for control, for the drive, for her, for the situation, but control was no longer available, because she had moved first. Not physically, strategically. Her hand moved subtly, almost unnoticeable to anyone else. A small action, a simple trigger, but its impact was immediate. That was the emotional hook, because the most powerful moves are not the ones you see. They are the ones that have already been set in motion. Dante's expression tightened slightly for the first time, not out of panic, but recognition, because now he understood. He had not stopped her. He had only delayed her, and delay had already been accounted for. The system around them began to shift, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough. Signals moving, responses activating. Something had been triggered, and as that realization settled fully into place, connecting every piece into a single, unavoidable conclusion, one final truth emerged. Before he could stop her, Harper triggered something that changed everything. She did not run from the Mafia boss. She ran from the monster hiding behind his power. The shift she triggered did not announce itself. It unfolded, quietly, precisely, irreversibly. What had once been a controlled environment now carried a different kind of tension, one that did not come from external threat, but from internal exposure. Systems began responding to signals that had already been set in motion. Movements adjusted, channels activated, patterns broke. Dante cross-felt it before he could see it, because change at that level was never visible first. It was structural, and structure was where real danger lived. That was the intellectual hook, because the most dangerous threat is not the one attacking from outside. It is the one already embedded inside the system. His attention returned to Harper Voss immediately, his focus sharper now, no longer calculating surface-level control, but deeper alignment. You didn't trigger this for protection, he said. Not a question. A realization. Harper met his gaze, her composure unchanged, her presence steady. No. The answer came without hesitation, because there was no reason to deny it anymore. Protection had never been the objective. Exposure had. That was the emotional hook. Because sometimes people don't run to survive. They run to reveal something no one else was supposed to see. The tension between them shifted again, but this time it was no longer about dominance or negotiation. It was about truth, and truth had already begun to surface. Dante's voice lowered slightly, his tone more precise than before. This was never about reaching the destination. Harper didn't respond immediately, because the statement was only partially correct, and partial truth was still incomplete. That was the intellectual hook, because understanding part of the truth is dangerous, but believing it's complete is worse. Her gaze held his, steady, controlled, deliberate. It was about what happens before I get there. The correction was subtle, but it changed everything, because it shifted the focus away from the end point, to the process, to the sequence, to the moment now unfolding. Dante absorbed it instantly, because that meant one thing. Whatever she had triggered was not waiting at the destination. It was already moving, already activating, already inside his system. That realization settled with sharp clarity, because it aligned with something he had been avoiding. The inconsistencies, the controlled losses, the patterns that had never fully made sense. They were not external failures. They were internal manipulations. That was the emotional hook, because betrayal is not when someone turns against you. It's when they've already been working against you without being seen. Dante's expression remained controlled, but beneath it, everything shifted. Someone inside my network, he said. Again, not a question. A conclusion. Harper didn't deny it, because that was the truth, and it had always been the truth. Her voice remained calm. You were never the target. The words landed quietly, but their impact was immediate. Dante's gaze sharpened, because if he wasn't the target, then everything he had assumed was wrong. That was the intellectual hook, because the moment you realize you weren't the focus, you have to question everything you thought you understood. He stepped closer, not aggressively, but with intent. Then who was? The question carried weight, because the answer would redefine everything. Harper held his gaze, her composure steady, but now there was no more distance in her truth. My family. The words were simple, but they carried history, loss, finality, and something else, something unresolved. That was the emotional hook, because behind every calculated move, there is usually a reason that was never healed. Dante didn't interrupt, didn't react, because he already understood what that meant. Her family had not been collateral. They had been targeted, deliberately, strategically, removed. And now she had returned, not for revenge alone, for exposure, for truth, for something that had never been finished. That was the intellectual hook, because unfinished destruction doesn't disappear. It evolves into something far more dangerous. Harper's voice remained controlled, but the weight beneath it deepened. It wasn't a war, she said. A pause. It was a decision. The distinction mattered, because war implied conflict, but decision implied intent, planned, directed, executed. Dante's thoughts aligned rapidly, connecting past actions with present consequences. There had been operations, eliminations, moves made to secure stability, threats removed before they could grow. And sometimes those threats had names, families, structures, entire networks. But what he had never fully questioned was how those targets were chosen. That was the emotional hook, because power doesn't just destroy enemies. It relies on someone deciding who the enemy is. His voice lowered further. You're saying someone inside my circle chose them. Not disbelief. Alignment. Harper nodded once. Not just chose, she said. Ensure to happen. The words shifted everything, because that meant this was not a mistake, not collateral, not accidental. It was engineered, and if it was engineered, then it had been done by someone with access, authority, Trust, that was the intellectual hook. Because the most dangerous betrayals are not carried out by outsiders. They are executed by those who are trusted the most. Dante's gaze hardened slightly, not with anger, but with precision, because now this was no longer external. This was internal, and internal threats required a different kind of response. His mind moved quickly through names, positions, access points. Who had the authority? Who had the information? Who had the ability to manipulate outcomes without being questioned? The list narrowed, faster than he expected, because trust limited options, and that was the problem. That was the emotional hook, because the smaller the list of suspects, the more dangerous each one becomes. Harper watched him carefully, her awareness sharp, because this moment was critical, not just for him, for everything, because now he was no longer questioning her. He was questioning his own system, and that was the shift she had been waiting for. That was the intellectual hook, because the moment someone starts questioning their own structure, control begins to fracture. Dante's voice remained calm, but now it carried something new. Focus. Why didn't you come to me with this? The question was direct, because if she knew, if she had evidence, if she had truth, then why not bring it to him directly? Why risk everything? Why create this situation? Harper didn't hesitate. Because I didn't know if you were part of it. The answer was immediate, and it landed with full impact, because it was honest, and honesty, in that moment, was more dangerous than anything else. That was the emotional hook, because trust is not broken when someone lies. It's broken when you realize you were never sure who to trust. Dante did not react outwardly, but internally, the shift was complete, because she had not trusted him. And now, he had to question why, not emotionally, structurally, because if doubt existed, it came from somewhere, from something, from patterns he had not seen, or had chosen not to. That was the intellectual hook, because doubt is never created without reason. It is built from things that didn't fully make sense. The system around them continued to shift, subtle but undeniable, responses activating, movements aligning, because whatever Harper had triggered was now moving through his network, and that meant one thing. Time was running out. Dante's gaze returned to her, sharper than before. You said you had proof, not a request, a demand for completion. Harper didn't move immediately, because this was the final step, the point where everything transitioned from theory to confirmation. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward her bag, not rushed, not hidden, because now there was nothing left to conceal. Dante watched closely, his attention fully aligned, because this was what everything had been leading to. She removed the second item, not the drive, something else, smaller, simpler, but heavier in meaning, because this was not just data. It was identity, connection, truth. That was the emotional hook, because the final proof is never the loudest. It is the one that cannot be denied. Dante's gaze locked onto it as she revealed it fully, and in that moment, everything aligned, every inconsistency, every shift, every control failure, every unexplained decision, all of it connected, because the name attached to that proof was not just someone inside his system. It was someone at the core of it, someone trusted, respected, untouched. Until now, that was the intellectual hook. Because the most dangerous enemy is not the one outside your empire. It is the one sitting at the center of it. Dante's expression remained still, but internally, everything changed, because now there was no doubt left, no uncertainty, no question, only truth. And that truth was worse than anything he had expected, because it wasn't just betrayal. It was design. From within, for years, undetected, until now, the silence between them deepened, not empty, but filled with everything that had just been revealed, because now the war had changed completely, not external, internal. And as that realization settled fully into place, locking every piece into a single, undeniable conclusion, one final truth emerged. And when the final name appeared, Dante realized the real enemy was already inside his empire. In the end, the flight was never her escape. The truth was. The boarding call echoed to the terminal with perfect timing. Orderly, neutral, unaware, passengers began to form a line, moving toward a future they believed was theirs to control. Tickets were scanned. Bags were lifted. Steps were taken forward without hesitation. Everything functioned as it should, except for one detail. Harper Voss did not move. She remained exactly where she stood, her posture steady, her focus no longer on the gate, but on what had already been set into motion. The destination that had once defined her plan no longer held the same weight, because the truth had already arrived. That was the intellectual hook. Because the moment truth is revealed, escape becomes irrelevant. Dante crossed it across from her, the final realization still settling into place. The name she had revealed had not just shifted his understanding, it had dismantled it, because the enemy was not approaching. He had always been present, inside the system, inside the structure, inside his trust. And now, there was no distance left between assumption and reality. The environment around them continued forward, but the space between them had changed entirely. Not tension, not conflict, decision. That was the emotional hook, because the most critical moments are not defined by action, but by the choices that follow understanding. Dante's gaze shifted briefly toward the boarding line, then back to Harper. "You're not leaving," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. Harper's expression remained composed. "No," the answer came calmly, without hesitation. Because leaving had never been the real objective. Not completely. That was the intellectual hook. Because sometimes the destination is not where the plan ends. It's where it begins to reveal itself. The final phase was no longer about movement. It was about confrontation, not with distance, but with truth. Dante exhaled slowly, his focus sharpening with a clarity that only came when all variables had aligned. "If this stays buried," he said, "everything remains stable." The statement was not emotional. It was structural, because power relied on stability, and stability often required silence. Harper met his gaze directly, and if it doesn't, the question was simple, but it carried consequence. Dante did not answer immediately, because the answer was not simple. Exposing the truth would not just remove one person. It would fracture trust across his entire system, create instability, invite conflict, reshape control. But hiding it would mean something else, allowing it to continue, allowing the same structure that had destroyed her past to remain intact. That was the emotional hook, because protecting power often means protecting the very thing that caused the damage. The silence between them deepened, not uncertain, not hesitant, but heavy with decision, because now there were only two paths, truth or control, and choosing one would destroy the other. That was the intellectual hook, because the hardest decisions are not about what is right. They are about what you are willing to lose. Movement behind them shifted, not random, not unnoticed, because the final piece had entered the space. The traitor, not dramatically, not visibly, but present, because people like that did not reveal themselves loudly. They existed quietly, within systems, within trust, within power, until the moment they were exposed. Dante did not turn immediately. He didn't need to, because he already knew, and that knowledge was enough. That was the emotional hook, because the moment you know who betrayed you, everything they've ever done starts to make sense. Harper's gaze moved slightly past him, confirming what he already understood. The timing, the positioning, the alignment of events. Everything had led to this moment. Not the airport, not the flight, the confrontation. Dante finally turned, slowly, deliberately, and there stood the man who had been inside his empire all along. Trusted, respected, invisible in a way that only the most dangerous people could be. The system did not react. The environment did not change, because exposure had not been announced. Not yet. That was the intellectual hook. Because the most powerful truths are revealed quietly, before the world realizes what has changed. Dante stepped forward slightly, his presence controlled, his focus precise. No anger, no reaction, only clarity. Because now, emotion would be a mistake, and mistakes were no longer acceptable. The traitor did not move, did not deny, did not attempt to escape, because he understood something fundamental. This moment was already decided. Harper remained still, her role complete, but not finished, because this was not just about revealing the truth. It was about what happened after, and that was still unfolding. That was the emotional hook, because exposing the truth is only the beginning. Dealing with it is where everything changes. Dante's voice remained calm, but final. It ends here. The words carried no threat, because they did not need to. They carried authority. And truth, combined, the structure shifted instantly, not visibly, but internally, because once the truth was acknowledged, everything connected to it began to collapse. The traitor's influence, his control, his position, all of it lost its foundation. That was the intellectual hook, because power built on deception collapses the moment it is seen clearly. Harper watched carefully, her awareness still sharp, still engaged, because this moment defined everything, not just for him, for her, because now she had reached the point she had been moving toward. The truth was exposed, the past was acknowledged, the enemy revealed, and now she had a choice, revenge or something else. That was the emotional hook, because the hardest part of revenge is not achieving it. It's deciding what comes after. Dante's decision came without hesitation, because hesitation would weaken everything. The truth was not buried. It was acted upon, quietly, efficiently, irreversibly. The traitor was removed from the structure, not through chaos, not through spectacle, but through control, because control was still necessary. But now it was aligned with truth. That was the intellectual hook, because real power is not choosing control over truth. It is rebuilding control after accepting it. The system began to stabilize again, not as it was before, but differently, more precise, more aware, more controlled, because now the hidden variable had been removed. Harper exhaled slowly, her posture unchanged, but her internal structure shifted, because this was not the ending she had planned. Not exactly. She had expected destruction, collapse, finality, but instead there was something else. Adjustment, continuation, possibility. That was the emotional hook, because sometimes the outcome you prepare for is not the one that actually happens. Dante turned back toward her, his gaze steady, his understanding complete. This doesn't end here, he said, not as a warning, as reality. Harper met his gaze. I know, because now they both understood something critical. The war had not ended. It had changed, not external, internal, structural. And now both of them were part of what came next, not as enemies, not as allies, but as something more complex, aligned by necessity. That was the intellectual hook, because the strongest alliances are not built on trust. They are built on shared understanding of what cannot be allowed to happen. The boarding line continued to move. Passengers disappeared down the gate. The flight prepared to leave. But Harper Voss did not board, because the destination was no longer ahead. It was here. Dante watched her for a moment longer before shifting his attention outward, his mind already moving toward the next phase, because now there was work to be done, not to win a war, but to control what remained after the truth. As the final moment settled into place, closing the space between past and present, intention and outcome, escape and reality, one final truth remained. She tried to hide at the airport, but the ticket he found became the reason neither of them could ever run again